Steven from ChainsawAce back today with another video. Today we will be looking at a Stihl 039 chainsaw that's approximately 24 years old. It has not run in forever, but it appears to have great compression. Okay, let's get the bar and the chain off the chainsaw to begin. I was told there's a problem with the front bar stud, so let's check that out first. Let's see what's going on with this front stud. Yep, it's tripped out in the engine housing, probably due to someone over-tightening the nut. No worries though, we can remove the bar nut by simply applying a little pressure and leverage while trying to unscrew the nut. Awesome, the nut came off as planned. Man, this machine is dirty. Let's lift the bar and chain off so we can get a closer look at the bar stud. Yeah, it's very loose. You can see plastic from the engine housing stuck in the stud's threads. Let's put it back for now, and we'll deal with it in a bit. Okay, let's get the air filter cover and the air filter off and see what we're dealing with. Good news, the intake looks relatively clean, which is a good sign for this chainsaw. The trigger and the throttle linkage response is also good. Okay, let's now remove the throttle linkage. Now, let's remove the master control switch by gently prying it up. The fuel line looks like it's probably hardened due to ethanol damage. Let's take a look down in the fuel tank as well to see what we can see. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're going to have to replace all this. Let's get the carburetor off so we can look further into the intake port. More times than not, you'll need to use a flathead screwdriver to gently pry the carburetor from the housing and the fuel line. Make sure you drain your fuel tank and leave the fuel cap off before removing the carburetor to avoid being sprayed by fuel. In this case, the fuel tank was bone dry, so it was not required. And the intake port is clean. This is a great sign for this chainsaw. Now that we have the carburetor off, let's take a look inside of it. Let's remove the metering diaphragm first. Yeah, just as I suspected, it's stiff. Ethanol and Father Time have struck again. We're going to have to replace this. Now, let's remove the metering needle assembly. Side note, I rarely remove the high and low speed needles when using a sonic cleaner to clean a carburetor. However, if I'm using something like Chem Dip or carburetor cleaner spray, I will remove both needles. Sonic cleaners make this step unnecessary in my experience. It saves you a little time. Now for the other side. And here is the screen. It does look clogged up. Let's pry it out. Yeah, we're going to need to replace all of this. Okay, let's get the carburetor into the ultrasonic cleaner. I set the temp to 80 degrees Celsius and the timer to a full 30 minutes. Oops, I forgot to remove the diaphragm and gasket from this part. No biggie. Okay, let's get to work on getting the new fuel line installed. Before we do that though, let's loosen the handle from the fuel tank so we have more room to work. This makes the fuel line installation much easier and less frustrating. I'm going to block off the intake and use some compressed air to clean this area just a bit. Now, let's pry the fuel line out using a flat head screwdriver. Whoops, I forgot to remove the fuel filter first. No worries though, we can still do it. Well, you can see how easily the fuel line broke when I pulled on it. Thanks, Ethanol. Okay, it's time to install the new fuel line. I like to start by lubricating it a bit. Pay attention to the straight edge on the fuel line. It will guide you to install the line in the correct orientation. The flat edge will line up with the seam on the fuel tank. Now carefully use a flat head screwdriver to press the line into the fuel tank. And now for the fuel filter. Time to retighten the handle assembly to the engine and fuel tank housing. The carburetor is now clean. Let's get it out of the sonic cleaner. Let's blow the carburetor out with some compressed air. Now, let's rebuild this carburetor with a new carburetor kit. Here is the new metering diaphragm. You can see how flexible it is compared to the old diaphragm, which is very stiff. Here's the carburetor's other diaphragm and gasket from the screen side of the carburetor. The older one is not in really that bad of shape. However, since a new kit came with these pieces, we will install them anyway. Here is the new screen. Let's install it by hand and use a number 2 pencil eraser to drive it all the way home. Pay no attention to my dirty fingernails as I install this metering needle assembly. I know I need a manicure. I'll try to get on that as soon as I'm done here. Be careful not to lose the spring during this step, which is very easy to do. Now carefully place the needle rocker assembly onto the spring and under the head of the needle. Make sure you hold the rocker into place as you install the screw. Here you can see the needle opening and closing as it should. Now let's install the new gasket and metering diaphragm into the carburetor. Make sure the metering side of the diaphragm is facing down against the needle rocker assembly. And now let's install a new gasket and diaphragm on the screen side of the carburetor. These did not really have to be changed. However, since a new kit came with them, we're going to install them anyway. And now let's reinstall our freshly rebuilt carburetor back onto the chainsaw. Looking at this up close, I can see residue left behind from my sonic cleaner on the throttle and choke arms. I need to change out my solution to avoid this in the future. Everything will work fine here though. When reinstalling the master control switch, make sure you put the stop ground contact into the proper position. Don't forget to place the ground wire into the notch on the master control switch. Now let's get the carburetor tightened back down onto the chainsaw. Now let's check if the throttle and choke assembly work correctly. Great, this is functioning perfectly. Let's go ahead and install a new spark plug. I'm pretty sure the one installed shipped with the saw when it was new. Yeah, that old. And now for some fresh fuel to test start the chainsaw. Success. This old chainsaw still has some fight left in it. Sounds good. And now let's get a new air filter installed. Here's a new one compared to the old one. Note that the air filter has the closed port on the back to match this version of the carburetor. When replacing your air filter, make sure you buy the one that matches your particular chainsaw. The Stihl 029, 031, 039, MS290, MS310, and MS390 chainsaws all use this style air filter. Some of the air filters have an open port on the back and some do not. Be sure to match your filter. Another problem that we need to address is a missing tank vent. I don't have access to an original tank vent at the moment, and the owner is in a hurry. However, I have a solution to repair this using a standard fuel line and an Eco-style tank vent. This will get us out of a bind, and it will work just fine. This is what the assembled tank vent looks like. It's super simple and super effective. And now for some non-sped up, real-time footage of me cleaning this chainsaw. You could say coffee is a passion of mine. And for those wondering, yes, this chainsaw was cleaned behind the recoil starter and everywhere else that mattered. This is a repair and not a restoration. It's hard to always capture everything on camera. Now let's address the stripped bar stud. You can see here that there's a lot of slack within the bar stud hole. Make sure the threads on the stud are cleared of any plastic from the engine housing. Some Stihl chainsaws have oversized studs to remedy this situation. However, there is not one available for this model that I have found. So we're going to repair this with some epoxy and steel wool. I cut some steel wool into smaller pieces that I'm going to mix into the epoxy for added strength. Make sure you thoroughly coat the stud deeply into each thread. Really slather it on. Now install the stud back into the chainsaw. Make sure to wipe off any excess epoxy. You don't want this stuff sticking your chain tensioner in place. That would be a new problem that's easily avoidable by simply wiping away any excess drippage. Now let's clean the years of dirt from this chain cover. Man, that's pretty bad. Now let's clean the bar and check it out to make sure everything is good there. I soaked the chain into the cleaner to remove excess buildup. I also sharpened it off camera. Now let's take care of this worn spur sprocket. Let's get this spur sprocket off by removing the E-clip and the washer. Sometimes a sprocket can be a little difficult to remove. This one is being difficult due to something being wrapped around the crank. If you find yourself in this situation, just use some pliers and it will come right off. Let's clean this area with compressed air. Now, let's grease the bearing and reinstall it onto the crankshaft. Here's the old spur sprocket compared with the new rim system sprocket. The main advantage of using a rim style sprocket is you can simply replace the rim when needed instead of a complete sprocket. It's much easier and cheaper this way in the long run. Line up the worm gear arm with the notch on the sprocket bell housing. Now install the rim onto the bell housing. Secured into place with a washer and E-clip. I like to rotate the E-clip a bit to make sure it's all the way in the groove. Now let's install the bar and chain. This is a 24-inch bar, so I'm going to cheat a little by using my $1 million trusty log wedge. This makes doing YouTube stuff and working on a long barred chainsaw a tad bit easier. When tensioning your chain, make sure to hold the tip of the bar up as far as possible. Tension the chain until the chain on the bottom of the guide bar pulls into the guide bar groove. Then tighten the front bar nut first, and then the back bar nut. Let's do a couple of test cuts to make sure everything is good. Great success! We beat Father Time and Ethanol once again. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.